You're watching the ETSI Virtual Event on boosting the impact of research and innovation through standardization. We are broadcasting live and are ready to hear from you. It's almost the end of the first day of the event, and now is your opportunity to ask questions of our presenters. Today's theme has been the research innovation standards ecosystem, the opportunities, enablers and challenges as we move beyond 5G. And we've been examining what needs to be done and who will be doing it through individual efforts and collaborative initiatives. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask about this, then send them in now using the widget on the website. But don't delay because we have a hard stop in about 40 minutes time. Well, let's welcome back our guests. Markus Merck, Vice Chairman of the ETSI Board, joins us from Germany. Bernard Barani, Deputy Head of Unit DG Connect with the European Commission, joins us from Brussels. Balázs Bertenyi, 3GPP TSG RAN Chairman, joins us from Hungary. Rui Aguiar, Steering Board Chairman, Networld 2020, joins us from Portugal. Anita Dola, CEO NGMN, joins us from Germany, and Colin Wilcock, 5GIA Board Chairman, also joins us from Germany. Well, welcome back everyone. Thanks for taking part in our discussion today and for helping to expand on this morning's presentations. It's our audience who are going to be driving the direction of the discussion over the next 40 minutes or so. So let's find out what questions they would like to ask. We've got a first one in, and I think this is probably Markus and Balázs. Markus, I'll come to you first with this if I can. Hi, great lineup for these 2 days. Thank you. I have two questions. Can independent researchers with no affiliation currently contribute to ETSI 3GPP standardization? And also, what's more important, is it the quality or quantity of patents submitted?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So let me first start answering for the ETSI case, and then I will hand over to Balázs. So in ETSI, in principle, you need to be an ETSI member in order to contribute to ETSI's work. But let me say here that the membership fee and conditions for, in particular, SMEs and academia is very reasonable. I would even say that ETSI is one of the most accessible and inclusive SDOs in the entire market landscape. So it is also possible if you are, for example, interested in a specific topic in a technical committee, that even as a non-member you are reaching out to the chairman of the committee, and the chairman would be able to invite you to join the meetings for a limited number of times. So this is actually a good opportunity to get to ETSI, learn about the work, and see whether there is actual value for your organization. So there is a specific case for so-called ISGs or industry specification groups. So ISGs typically allow also participation for non-ETSI members, but you would need to reach out to ETSI and sign actually a membership agreement to this specific ISG. So if that's of interest to you, I would again recommend contacting the ETSI Secretariat. I think the Secretariat would be most happy to guide you along this way. And with that, I would give the floor to Balázs, please, for answering for the 3GPP case. Thank you.
Yes, excellent point by Markus. It is very much possible for independent researchers and small research companies to take part in standardization. We actually already have a couple of examples. Like as Markus said, the entry barrier through ETSI is actually very, very low, both in terms of resources and in terms of finances. So I would basically recommend two things. Become a member and find friends. You basically need to find those companies, those researchers that are like-minded, working on the same topic, and try to collaborate and bring your efforts together. Primarily, the main way to succeed in standardization is through convincing others and convincing the industry. So you need to find your friends and find your partners who you want to collaborate with, and then you'll be successful.
Great. Well, thank you both for that advice. And yes, I echo that as well. There's no real barriers there. We're very inclusive community. Now, look, we've got a number of questions on a similar theme, and it refers to Pierce O'Donoghue's presentation from DG Connect earlier today. Bernard, I'm going to ask you these. I'm trying to condense a few of these together, but it's all about the idea that Europe needs to be able to support itself in the development of key technologies to support that digital ecosystem and be self-sufficient. But what does that mean? Only companies and researchers who are European nationals, headquartered European companies? How will Europe ensure 6G leadership and digital sovereignty whilst at the same time avoid excluding those global players who've traditionally been very much involved in European research?
So thank you, Guy, for the question. I think it's a complex question, and let me say that my director said in his speech that we are open. So the basic rule of the game is openness. What we mean by technology sovereignty has to be first related to what is it that we call critical technologies for Europe. What are the critical sectors where Europe wants to have an offer? And obviously, and this is something you can read in the communication on the cybersecurity toolbox that the Commission published on 29th of January this year, telecom infrastructures, and in particular 5G and probably 6G as well, are and will be increasingly considered as critical infrastructure. For European policy perspective, it's very key that Europe has technological capabilities from the supply side in this domain. And this is something that we have, but we need to, let's say, increase and nurture and even augment. As my director said, we are taking for future research a so-called supply chain approach. That means that we will, with our approach, try to use the strong assets that we have in connectivity research, and we have a very strong ecosystem for research in Europe for connectivity with a lot of very good institutes from the research side or from the industrial side. So these assets in connectivity, we want to leverage them to recreate capabilities where there are opportunities. And we see that there are opportunities coming up now on the device side. And I think Colin mentioned that in his speech this morning, with a lot of flurry of future connected terminals, be they cars, cranes, robots, whatever you think. So this is where Europe should also have some capabilities from the supply side and also from the service side. That means all the things which will be implemented in edge cloud. From the cloud to the device, we take a kind of integrated perspective where Europe would like to construct a capability. Let's say technological supply capabilities. So that's the objective. This is what we are putting up front for our next research phase that we will launch with the industrial partners. In terms of participation, the rules are pretty clear as well. So the framework for research implementation that we have to tackle this particular subject is openness. But there are some sort of caveats and some sort of possibilities which are open to restrict certain calls to certain set of companies being located in Europe or being located or headquartered in Europe. But this is identified on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the nature of the call. If the call is related to a very sensitive, critical security issue, for instance, we may want to apply a clause of restricted participation. But this is not a kind of blanket clause. It's a possibility which has to be implemented on a call-by-call basis. The logic, the overriding logic of the program being openness as it was under Horizon 2020.
Thank you very much, Bernard. As you say, it's a complex question, this one. Thanks for addressing that for us. And I think we'll probably get a few more on that similar vein in the next few minutes or so. If I could move on to one we've just got in. This is for Anita, really. Refers to your presentation where you set out NGMN's future plans beyond 5G. The question is, there's a lot of talk years ago about 5G and engaging with vertical markets and other industries. Before we look at 6G visions, are we on course for our current 5G vision, or did we overestimate what 5G could actually deliver?
Yeah, thank you, Guy, and thanks for the question. It's a really great question, which we discussed also extensively in our NGMN partnership here. And I think the answer is pretty clear. For 5G, we still have to do a lot of work. So 5G deployments are ongoing. We know that we are moving from non-standalone to standalone, that we also will adopt additional new standards which are due to be released to deliver the services. We work on network slicing, on service-based architectures, on cloud architectures to enable also roaming with a decent service level. And of course, we need to get closer with the vertical industry I think it's also a matter of trust and also to address the right requirements and to have an open dialogue here. So this is for 5G, and this is clearly NGMN's main focus at the moment. So when it comes to beyond 5G, we just believe, so the world is moving on. There are already a lot of activities ongoing for 6G, and of course, mainly in the research area, but not only. And therefore, as NGMN, as the name states, Next Generation Mobile Network Alliance, we are keen to provide impactful guidance. And here we said we need to see what can be delivered with 5G anyway, and what needs to come on top. And at this stage, we really want to avoid yet another technology hype. So this is why we focus on the drivers.
Thank you, Anita. Unless anybody else wants to comment on that one, I can move on to our next question, because we are getting a lot of questions in from our audience. Colin, I think this could be a 5G IA question here. This is a question from a representative of the French government who says, what first steps would you recommend to a vertical with no research and innovation involvement? And our questioner says, we've already invested in a small delegation in various standards bodies, but we'd like to be more involved in the research and innovation process and thus influence the standards in a more effective manner. Colin, what advice can you give?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think there's sort of two main areas that one should investigate in such a situation. So I think the first is to look at the possibilities for collaborative research. And this could be national, or it could indeed be European. We have talked in some of the presentations about the Smart Networks and Services partnership, which is starting sort of the middle of next year and will then be providing funding for both 5G and 6G with the verticals. So the advantages of such collaborative projects is that you can bring all the key stakeholders together in a fairly neutral environment, in a funded environment, so that they can actually try out the technologies. And the key point here isn't just to see what technology there is at the moment, but rather to understand both domains, the telecoms and the verticals, and think about what could be, how can we develop the technology, whether that be 5G, as we've just heard, which has some development still to come, or 6G. We need to understand how we can maximize that potential, how we can develop that technology to really bring benefit to the verticals. So one way is collaborative research. The other way that I think is perhaps even more immediate is to better understand what's going on in standardization. And a number of the market representation partners from 3GPP have banded together to create a series of workshops and seminars where you can learn about how standardization works. And more than that, what we try and do is we try and bring the key players together in the separate domains. So the automotive people together, the people from smart cities together. So by bringing those key actors together, they can discuss amongst themselves what are the key requirements? What are the things we want to try and push into standardization? Because standardization needs a certain critical mass. If you go as a single company, especially a small company, there is a certain threshold for getting those ideas through. And as was said previous, one of the key things you need to do is you need to build some sort of group of like-minded companies. And by bringing these communities together, they can discuss amongst themselves, come to a common idea about requirements, and then bring that to standardization as a complete set, if you will, as a coordinated view, rather than that from a single company. Beyond that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to actually compare the requirements between the different domains, because quite often there are common ideas or common requirements, and that helps even more with trying to get a coherent vision of what those future standards should be.
Great, thank you very much, Colin. Balazs, you want to come in and some extra thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to add on to the great points from Colin, one of the key themes we have been applying in 5G standardization is to ensure that the economies of scale prevails. And this is where Colin's points are very important, that you really want to consolidate the requirements and the functionalities across different verticals so that you actually come to a common platform and you don't create separate silos where you lose the economies of scale, but you maintain a single platform. And the difference or the add-ons of the different verticals would come on the higher layers, on the software and the application layer.
Thank you for those comments, thanks. We've got a few questions in about researchers and from the academic side. Rui, perhaps I could address this one to you. The question is, how do you get researchers to collaborate and contribute to standards at an early stage, early enough to help with European-wide research and innovation agendas, when there's so much pressure to create and safeguard IPRs and potentially lucrative patents, perhaps they don't really want to share at this early stage?
Actually, it's a very good question. And probably if I knew the solution, I would be the CEO of a large telecom company instead of being an academic. I think that some of the answers already sort of touched the issue. It is, I would say, of mutual benefit to develop collaborative research. And that collaborative research, when we are bringing more fundamental researchers with more practical researchers, with people more near the development from companies, actually usually allows us to go from the moment where you do have, let's say, a very weird or just speculative idea, and then you work it through until its conclusion. But this advantage actually also brings this added point of forcing these different parties, these different cultures to talk together. And I would say often to negotiate how to handle the pressure for being the first in developing something and showing to the world, with the pressure of let's try to retain our IPR and make sure that what we are doing will turn into an economical profit for the companies and everybody in the process. There is no easy answer to this. What I think we all recognize is that this is a challenge that has to be navigated and has to be explored by different teams in different ways, depending on the subject, depending on the circumstances, depending on the very diverse context where people will face.
Thank you, Rui. And Marcus, would you like to add to that?
The question seems to imply that standardization is only suitable for those who have developed a substantial patent or IPR portfolio, and I would challenge actually such an understanding. There are, of course, areas and domains where organizations are actively pursuing patenting, but it's not the case everywhere, and it's definitely not a prerequisite for organizations, in particular for academia, to contribute to standards bodies. So even if your organization is, for example, more active on the fundamental research side, is more focusing on publications, is more focusing on bringing your technology to the attention of the market. even in such a case, it is very possible and recommended actually to bring your results into standardization groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And Bernard, I did think that we'd have another few questions about Piers' presentation earlier, and indeed we do. We've got this one just come in. The question is, Piers mentions the need for regional security within Europe's approach to research and innovation, but in practice, does this create tensions with the practices of global standards bodies or affect how global security standards are developed?
I don't think that it creates any particular tension. I think global standards, as Piers has mentioned, is still very much part of our, let's say, line of thinking. So we will, by all means, try to support as much as we can global standards to emerge. We even have at this moment in time a dedicated project with ETSI, which is called the Indico project, which is kind of nurturing or favoring global discussions among all regions to see where we can partner and where we have common interest to develop or to stimulate a global standardization process. So that's still very much a part of our agenda, the global standardization perspective, and for all sorts of reasons, for the economies of scales, economies of scopes, interoperability, citizen type of interest, protection of citizen interest. So that's really clear. From the cybersecurity perspective, I think that all the elements of our strategy are well described in the communication, again, that we published on 29th of January, which is called the Cybersecurity Toolbox, that talks about, in particular, of diversity of supply chain. And this comes back to the previous question on sovereignty. The European approach is to have a diverse supply landscape, whatever the standards are, but these providers or these suppliers should be able to respond to the market requirements according to global standards that have been defined. But we clearly stimulate competition and alternative suppliers to emerge on the market in such a way that Europe can choose. And of course, when we talk about diversity of supplier, we think of at least one European source of supply ability to address the European markets with the security levels that we want to achieve for the critical infrastructures.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Balázs, we've got, not surprisingly, at least three questions I can see here about 3GPP, related to 3GPP. Let me try and consolidate those down, because I think the thrust of these questions is very, very similar. From the event so far, the driver for 6G timescale seems to be based on the usual cycle of generations, but this is a self-imposed cycle. So what is the real need for a new generation from a commercial perspective? And in the next few years, we will certainly see more open initiatives such as ORAN, Open RAN. How can we ensure the convergence between innovation standards and the open approach in order to avoid a fragmentation of this ecosystem as we make our way towards 6G?
Okay, that's several questions in one. Let me try to address them one by one. So, like a new generation and the need for the new generation, and when do we call something 6G as opposed to 5.5G? I'm a radio person, so from that perspective, this definition has been pretty easy for us, because whenever you bring in a new radio technology that is non-backwards compatible with the previous one, a new waveform, essentially you have a new generation. That was the case with 4G. We switched to OFDM from wideband CDMA, and then for 5G, we again changed the waveform. So that was a clear definition for a new generation. Now, again, if I look at this from a radio perspective, the current radio technology of 5G can take us up only so far in terms of spectrum bands. So if we look at higher spectrum bands, eventually things like terahertz, it's inevitable that we're going to have to look at new waveforms, and we're going to have to break the backwards compatibility with 5G, and that's when officially 6G starts. Now, there are many other elements and innovations going on, openness, Open RAN, opening up interfaces. It's much harder to actually draw a line between generations on those elements. I think it's more a matter of taste and more a matter of PR or timing, if you will. But those are very important, or just as important, elements of innovation going forward. Having basically more flexibility in the architecture through openness, that all these different kinds of use cases of 5G, let it be private 5G or commercial 5G or a combination of both, can flourish.
Thank you very much for addressing those, Balázs. Yes, indeed, there's quite a few questions, all very kind of similar and related there. Anybody else see this need to maybe embrace or involve the open source community more? We've been having this discussion for years now, but any other viewpoints about how we can perhaps become more agile or more fleet-footed in what we do with our standardization and innovation work?
Open source is, I would say, often misguided, or at least suffers a lot of mis-expectations from those that really are not used to open source. So I would say that for innovation, open source is absolutely essential. But innovation means people that are developing concepts, ideas, proofs of something, small demos in control environments. Now, when you go to industry, you actually want reliable things. And in our industry, we are talking about 24/7, 365 days per year. And we are talking about highly complex systems, then will need to be integrated with other complex systems, where you need to have technical support, where you need to have proper quality of service guarantees on your equipment. So when you reach that stage, I would say that people over-expect what they can get from open source. So yes, open source, it's very good for in early stage for jump starting something. But when it becomes a business, when it becomes something that needs to be reliable, I think we are still transitioning in how to explore that. And if you see, there are several examples that everybody calls that's open source. Let's say Android, something that we all have. But we all are using our own versions of Android customized by manufacturers. If you are, when we are running stock Android, it was actually delivered by Google. So it was perfectly controlled for their environment. So when we want to reach certain levels of quality, we really need to know how to transition these open source early products into commercials. I know Open RAN has a lot of expectations, but when you go to aspects like, let's say, we have a huge pressure to improve efficiency. We have a huge pressure to reduce cost, and you have a huge pressure to reduce energy. Sooner or later, you are going to move into dedicated solutions, optimized solutions. And as soon as you start the optimization path, keeping on calling that open source becomes more and more complicated.
Thank you very much, Rui. And Anita, would you like to comment?
Yes, thanks, Rui. So I try to keep my answer short for what I believe is a very complex question. I think open source, we cannot neglect open source, and it has also advantages and disadvantages. And in some of our projects, we consider open source, and we also look at open source, how to include it, and what is needed. When it comes to open interfaces, also I believe it's extremely important to open the ecosystem, to have a richer ecosystem here. What we cannot forget, especially as NGMN representing operators here as well, is the operation of the networks. So how can an operator end-to-end operating network and guarantee 24/7 service level agreement here. So from that point of view, that's what I meant with actually it's a complex situation, but absolutely necessary to foster innovation and a richer ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Anita. We've got a quick question in here. Marcus, I think I might ask you this one first. As we move along the path of 6G innovation and research, how does European standardization bodies picture those counterparts in other parts of the world, other regional bodies? Do they view them as competitors or partners?
Well, I would say definitely as partners, right? I mean, as we heard earlier today, we are believing in open markets. We are believing in collaborative work. We are believing in joint effort towards developing future generations of networks. So what you, for example, see in 3GPP, and here probably Balash can give again comments. We have organizational partners across all regions, basically.
Thank you, Marcus. Your audio is breaking up a bit there, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying, and I think you were wanting to ask Balash as well if he wanted to give a view from 3GPP.
Yes, I can maybe chime in on this, on Marcus's great point. So essentially, if we look at how things have gone with 5G and how we expect it to go with 6G, right now, 6G is starting to be in an expansion phase where all the different regional research, private public partnerships and other research activities are starting to blossom, and there's going to be overlap. There is going to be a lot of collaboration. But I think the key in this research phase is that we don't leave any stones unturned. So as opposed to like making sure we have no overlap, I don't believe that in this phase the overlap between regions is a problem. I would rather say we have to make sure that we looked at everything in all angles, because by the time we get to the consolidation phase, whereby all these different research activities come together in the pre-standard phase, where we try to really consolidate which way 6Gs ought to go, we have to make sure that all those research activities have run their course in the different regions, and we're basically ready to consolidate.
Thank you. And Balash, there's another question here which maybe you could quickly clarify. Somebody's asking about 5.5G. I think you mentioned it during your presentation earlier. And the question is, what is 5.5G in 3GPP? Is it clearly defined, or is it just at this stage a loose term?
It's not defined. I mean, 5.5G is just a very loose term that started to be used here and there. But again, if we look at how we have done each generation in the past, there has typically been like a mid-generation marker, like towards like halfway through of a generation, where you basically have looked at the initial goals of that generation in terms of requirements, have pretty much fulfilled those, but then there are new sets of requirements coming, and then you're still trying to address that within that generation. With LTE and 4G, we had LTE Advanced and then LTE Advanced Pro, as clearly markers that marked new technology capabilities. And I expect we're going to have this kind of an evolution path also with 5G, that at some point in the not so distant future, like a year or two from now, we would have completed all the functionalities for the initial 5G vision. And then we're going to look at expanding that considerably still within the 5G platform. And that's when we would probably introduce a new marker, whether it's 5G Advanced or 5.5G, I don't know. But I think it's realistic to assume that 5G is going to run its course well beyond the initial scope of the vision still.
Thank you very much. I've got a related question, which I may ask Colin if I can. And that is, do we know what the business requirements of beyond 5G, 5.5G, shall we call it, what they could address beyond what we're doing under the general umbrella of 5G?
That's a very good question, and I think it's always the case that people ask about what's the killer use case for 6G, for example. We really don't know. To be honest, we're still not quite clear what the killer use case is for 5G. We do have some idea of requirements, and we do have some idea of requirements evolution. So having worked together with a lot of the key verticals, that information, that knowledge that we've gained by working together is now going into standardization with the evolution then of 5G as it matures. We can see that, as Balázs rightly said earlier, that 5G will evolve. I mean, we're still pretty much at the beginning of the 5G story. There's still a lot of evolution to go there, but there is clearly subjects being talked about. I mean, terahertz was mentioned. There are some other areas as well where we can see those areas are beyond what we can currently do with 5G. So in the same way that 5G has started that digital transformation of these vertical domains, 6G, we believe, will then be the way of going beyond that. And some of the visions, some of the aspects of 6G are truly new. The ability to go to frequencies where we can also use the network, not just for communication, but also for sensing where things are, means that 6G is perhaps a technology where we can tie together the digital and the physical world. And these sort of ideas will create whole sets of new use cases, but also new requirements in terms of latency and positional accuracy and things like that. And really 6G at the moment is an aim and a series of research or potential research areas. It's nothing more than that. So we're still a long, long way from deploying anything. That's more 2030 or 2030 plus. So one shouldn't expect a fully worked out, costed example of the technology. Now is the time for looking at the fundamental technological building blocks, what 6G will be. The actual standardization of 6G is way down the road. It's still a long way away.
Thank you very much, Colin. And I think we've probably got time for one final question, which is very much related to this one. And you've answered a lot of this already. Thank you very much. But the question is it's far too early to define what 6G will include, but is it possible to say what the principal differentiator would be when we move from 5G evolved into something that we may label 6G? Anybody want to look at that as to what the principal differentiator may be? Very helpful for researchers. Colin, back to Colin.
Well, I think I mentioned it there in my example that I think the key thing in actual fact will be this tying of the digital and the physical world. So the fact at the moment 5G does everything in the digital world and ties together our different vertical industries and things like that, and does that wonderfully. And we do begin to see things like VR and things like that. But it's not one-to-one. I think we've all heard of the idea of digital twins, the ability to model the physical world in the digital domain. And by doing this, that you can shortcut a lot of the problems and the issues. For example, if you're looking at maintenance of machines or the health of a person, if I have a digital model, I can better understand when something is going to go wrong, or when I need to give medicine to people, or what the effect of that medicine will be. In 5G, the two worlds are still distinct. We have the model on the computer, we have the communications network, and the crossover between those two worlds, the crossover between our physical world, what we're living in here, and the digital world is, I don't know, we model it once, we maybe change data once a year, but the two are separate worlds. In 6G, we can bring that together. We can have a situation where the network is continually updating this digital version of the real world. And clearly that will make a huge difference in terms of the power of that digital example of what it can actually say, what we can actually do with it. And I think that's probably going to be the key differentiator.
Thanks very much, Colin. That's a great answer to end with. Thank you, everyone. We have reached the end of our session, and in fact the end of day one and our live Q&A. So thank you very much for participating. We'll be back again tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. UK time. That's 10 a.m. Central European time. And our theme for day two is making it happen. And we'll be taking a technology deep dive on research opportunities in standards. We've got plenty of presentations and a special panel discussion, and we'll conclude the event with another live Q&A session. And a quick plug for me, we mentioned terahertz several times during this session. We've got a presentation on terahertz communications tomorrow. Don't miss that one. So please join us tomorrow for the second and final day of the ETSI Virtual Event on boosting the impact of research and innovation through standardization. Until then, thank you for watching and goodbye.